I want to talk about welfare states and an illiberal dynamic that they contain embedded in them. And a little bit of a caution, I'm not going to give the sweeping, we should have no welfare state talk, that would be some other occasion. But these are things to think about when you have a welfare state, which last time I checked, Belgium has one, a very small, tiny welfare state, as you all know, that there are always dangers to liberal democracy that are implicit in them. And at the very least, you have to be aware of these problems. So let's just start then with thinking about the welfare state. It's gone by a lot of different names around the world, but there's a core principle that the state is going to be taking responsibility for the provision of various parts of the well-being of the population. So those will be taken out of their personal hands and responsibility and administered by the state. And typically we think education was an early one, although it's interesting, many people say, look, we can have state-dominated education and high literacy rates. Historically, high literacy rates precede the state educational systems, which happened in all European countries. But the state has taken large responsibility, and then also healthcare, and then a variety of other things, including housing, and so on. So these vary around the world, the extent of welfare states, what things have come into their portfolio and what not. But the general principle is that the state is going to take some responsibility for the provision of things and remove all or most or some of that from the civil society sector. And they've popped up almost everywhere. So it's really quite an interesting phenomenon that the globe is now peopled by national states, the whole Westphalian system, but also in the last 70 years or so, the welfare state. Now, it was originally created, and by this I don't mean all systems of communal social benefit. These have long histories, by the way, very deep in the Low Countries here, where the communes would have various systems for those people who, as we say, fell between the cracks. But the modern understanding of the welfare state was a political strategy, and the one person to be most identified with that was Otto von Bismarck, who was a very famous fascist model from Germany, as you can see. And it was a political strategy to defeat two threats to his authority and power. On the one hand, the new rising socialist movements, and on the other hand, liberalism. And both of these he conceived as enemies. And this strategy of what he called state socialism was an attempt to deny them political support and base of support. And he was quite clear in his statements. The purpose was to make one dependent on the state. Because what had been growing in Germany at the time, as had been happening all across Europe, was mutual aid societies and commercial insurance organizations had been rising very dramatically. I have other presentations and talks, things I've written documenting this. But a huge rise of worker organizations in which we would come together, pool our resources, and then hire doctors, for example. And each person would have the right to go and visit a doctor. So in the United Kingdom, these mutual aid societies were much larger than trade unions. They dwarfed the trade union movement. It was quite small in comparison. And if you go to most British hospitals, which are administered by the National Health Service, go look at the founding stone. You know how the British are, they'll build one stone and they write something on the side of it, Lord so-and-so was here, or this company, and so on. And invariably, or almost invariably, they were built by friendly societies, and then later taken over by the National Health Service. But the vast hospital system in the UK was initially built by these friendly societies. And what Bismarck did not want was for this to continue rising in Germany, because it meant these were independent sources of social and political activity. And he perceived them as threats to the state. For some very good reason in this context. They also tended to be more liberal in their orientation. Working class, humble people who would contribute very small, we would consider modest amounts of money on a monthly basis that would then be administered by sometimes a professional staff, sometimes volunteers. And these were growing quite rapidly throughout, all across Europe, but also Australia, Latin America, North America, and so on. And he looked at the French system, which at this time was even then more centralized than most of the rest of Europe, thanks to the French history. And he noticed that French civil servants received, rather than a capital amount, they received a monthly pension. Under the friendly society arrangements and savings clubs, you owned the capital that was accumulated. It belonged to you. But under the French system that he admired so much, you were paying into it, but nothing belonged to you. You received every month an amount of money until you died. It's a very different dynamic socially than having the ownership of your own assets. So this was a political strategy, turned out to be tremendously successful. We could talk later about some of the problems that it faced later on in the Weimar Republic. Specifically, the staggering social burden of the state pension system, which led to the bankruptcy of the Weimar system, notably miners' pensions, which were simply unpayable because they had made all of these promises. I'll talk about the dynamic of this. The Weimar Republic is the most frightening case study of collapse of a social welfare state into something more horrifying than one would wish to visualize. The policies create a number of incentives, and those may not always align with the intent of the creators, right? There's also a problem of short-term and long-term. You notice Bismarck in that picture is rather an old man. It's unlikely he was thinking very deeply about what would happen in 60 years, right? Because he was going to be dead. So we have this interesting question of short and long term. In many of these welfare states, we are entering the long term now. And we're going to be facing the very serious fiscal consequences of decisions made 30, 40, 50 years earlier when it seemed they were so affordable. So I'll talk a little bit about that with a few case studies. So if we're concerned about liberal democracy, especially in the face of an ongoing global assault on liberal democracy, which if we wanted the discussion we could talk about. There is an alliance of anti-liberal powers on the planet that has now emerged, and they coordinate. The Russian state, the Iranian state, Chinese Communist Party, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, and all of their little proxies like the Houthis and Hezbollah and so on. So we've got this problem. But now we also have a deep problem of fiscal sustainability. And when you have these kinds of crises, it's quite common, as we are seeing in the United States, someone would come along and say, I alone can fix this. Oops, disappeared. I blame the KGB.
Try
also a problem.
turning it on.
You'll miss the amazing graphics that spent hours preparing.
Screen share.
Something, what is it?
Quick share.
Quick share. Click here. There we go. Go back to this thing again. Some brief control. Well, I could keep talking for a moment about this. And those of us who are concerned about liberal democracy have to be paying very close attention to these deep challenges that are emerging. All right, thank you. Well, Now, there was a book I read quite a few years ago, Contradictions of the Welfare State by Klaus Hofer. I don't recommend it highly, he's a very doctrinaire Marxist sociologist. But one of the concepts that came up, which he tried to deploy in a Marxian economic context that frankly didn't make a lot of sense, but this was a deep and important point. A contradiction inherent in a system. When we talk to Marxists, they always talk about the contradictions of late capitalism. Late capitalism, by the way, is over 100 years old, by the way. So this lateness is just lasting for centuries. But the contradictions of late capitalism, which in the next few weeks are going to lead to its destruction. But that notion, we shouldn't dismiss this idea of contradictions inherent in the system, because there's a deep insight, which they drew actually from liberal thinkers. A contradiction is a tendency inherent within a specific mode of production, so Marxism talking, to destroy those very preconditions on which its survival depends. Contradictions become manifest in situations where, in other words, a collision occurs between the constituent preconditions and the results of a specific mode of production. Or where the necessary becomes impossible and the impossible becomes necessary. Cut through all the Marxist fuzziness. What he's talking about is that you might have some system that produces an outcome that destroys the precondition for its own existence. And that's something we should be paying attention to. Whether, and here's a conservative critique of liberalism, conservatives have said, and I think we should take it seriously, does liberalism recreate the social conditions conducive to liberalism, which tend to focus on personal responsibility, taking charge of your own life, cleaning up your own messes, as we say, and so on. And it's an important and interesting question. One of the things I think conservatives raise that is something we liberals should pay careful attention to. But it could be that this is happening with the welfare state, the deep level. I want to talk about degrees of social trust and what the evidence shows on that. So I want to address briefly three illiberal dynamics. One, welfare states as tragedies of the commons. So Gerhard Harden's phrase, used in environmental economics, applied in this case. Pay-go systems, pay as you go, or pay-go, which are basically pyramid schemes. They're well known for people who study financial fraud. They are, sorry? Ponzi schemes, in effect. Chain letters, there are many different names for these. But they generate social conflict over time. And then finally, this contradiction question, the erosion of the social conditions of trust necessary for the maintenance of a social state. What is called tax morale, willingness to pay taxes, and benefit morale, which is refraining from claiming benefits you do not qualify for under the existing system and code. So let's look at those. First, the welfare state as a tragedy of the commons. So Gerhard Harden addressed it in the question of grazing sheep on a commons of some sort. Everyone has an incentive to add more sheep, but the consequence is overgrazing. It cannot sustain that number of sheep. But each one of us individually faces an incentive, why not add more? And I actually saw that at work in Namibia when I had a meeting with farmers there. The state said all the land is a commons belonging collectively to the people. Every person upon achieving 18 years of age had the right to add cattle to the land. Everyone added cattle, and cows were dying. They ate all of the grass. There's just nothing more to consume. And the farmers were trying to explain, it was like sitting in a property law class at UCLA Law School, but these were farmers who didn't speak any European languages, explaining, we want to own property so we can limit the number of cows on it. But our Marxist government run by SWAPO doesn't understand this. So the idea is, in the case of fisheries, which is another commons around the world, if I don't catch the fish, somebody else will catch the fish. So there's no benefit to me of refraining from catching that additional fish. And you end up with overfishing, very serious problem around the planet, in cases of lack of well-defined property for land, overgrazing. But in this case, we have the problem that if I don't get the subsidy, somebody else will. It's not like my tax burden is going to go down. And if I don't pay the tax, somebody else will pay the tax, or they'll go to deficit financing and borrow. So why not go ahead and collect the benefit, right, and game the system? Because there's no benefit to me for refraining from going and gathering a benefit from the state. Everyone has that incentive, and the consequence is the depletion of the resource over time. In this case, the collective pool of all of our assets together. So nearly everyone, from billionaires to retirees, this is one of the biggest welfare queens in America today, Elon Musk, goes to the state for subsidies, all kinds of subsidies. He's presenting himself always as a brilliant entrepreneur. He may be, but he's also one of the most efficient farmers of the public finance. In just the case of Nevada alone, not only did he get 10 years of paying zero tax, okay, I don't like paying taxes also, but on the other hand, he is drawing substantial benefits from the state for which he pays nothing. They even gave him $125 million of tradable tax credits, which is a lovely way of calling just a check, just a pure subsidy. What it meant was, he got $125 of tax credits he could sell to other people. So you have a $10 million tax burden, well, you would be willing to pay up to $10 million to buy a credit against the tax. So he immediately, in the first months, got $25 million just in cash, in effect, from the state. So this is a gigantic welfare benefit, and he does this across the board with almost all of his companies. He may, in fact, be a brilliant entrepreneur. I'm rather neutral on the question. But he's also quite good at farming the public, if you will, and extracting benefits from us. But also other groups, pensioners. This is the one that now we're facing in all of the wealthy countries around the world, whether it's Japan or Korea or United States or Belgium, which is because of the changing demographics, falling birth rates, et cetera, very large groups of pensioners demanding more resources from the state. And you can look at it country by country. The base of the pyramid is collapsing. It's falling quite rapidly. So instead of having 11 workers per pension recipient on the state pension, we're going down to situations where it's 2, 2.4, and so on. It's quite dramatically different. And most of these systems are cash negative. So the United States, the Social Security system, which was established in the 1930s, even though there was already an existing robust system of private pensions and the like, generated tremendous benefits in the short term. The first people to go in got money for which they had not paid anything. So they were happy with that system. That persisted for quite a number of years. There was a surplus. Social Security money coming in was greater than that going out. They said, don't worry, we're investing it. And to Americans, they said, well, that sounds great. So they're setting my money aside. But it was 100% invested in government bonds, which are just promises to pay out of future taxes. These were not investments in companies or farms or things that were generating additional value. They're just promises to pay. So the entire trust fund, one of my favorite pictures on this, the trust fund is a file cabinet in West Virginia. It has a piece of paper that says, I owe you $170 trillion. That's it. That's the trust fund. It's not a set of productive assets. And in 2010, the system already went cash negative, which is to say cash out is greater than cash in. They say, well, we're drawing from the government bonds. But even that, which means they're just drawing from general tax revenues at the moment, even for the differential between the income of Social Security tax and the outgo, even that is going to be exhausted in just a couple of years. And it will go entirely to general revenue funding for the differential. And so there's talk, I'm now at an age, I've just reached that magic age where I could become a recipient of money from the state. I don't. But it's likely I could only do it for maybe 15 years. At which point they have a problem. There just won't be enough money to fund all of the current people who have a claim on the system. So this is happening all over the world. Just yesterday, I randomly picked up pieces from the Bangkok Post, from Malaysia, from Japan, from India, United States, Canada. So it's not just a couple of European countries. This is a global issue that we're facing right now. Now this question then of these contradictions, and the issue that has been addressed is social trust. So for a very long time we heard the Bernie Sanders of the world and lots of college professors say how wonderful it is that in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, we might add Finland and Iceland, there's so much social trust, they have welfare states, ergo, welfare states create social trust. Why not? You see, social trust society. They would overlook Greece, Italy, Portugal, and so on, which are societies with quite large welfare states, in some cases far more, I'll use the word with quotes, generous than the Scandinavian or Nordic ones, and very low degrees of social trust. So just on the very surface, there's something wrong with this thesis. And the available historical evidence is the social trust preceded the establishment of the welfare states. It wasn't that the welfare states caused the social trust. And Nima Sanandaji, who's a very interesting social scientist in Sweden, he's a Kurdish, Iranian, Swedish, writing in English. I edited one of his books, and I can tell you this was a challenge. But he's a really smart, serious social scientist, although untangling Kurdish, Farsi, and Swedish into English was a delightful 6-month project for me. But what he has done is to look at changing levels of social trust, focusing on Northern European and North American countries. And the evidence is pretty strong. Over the long term, welfare states erode the social trust that makes them sustainable. So, in other words, you have social trust, you get a welfare state, and people say, I'll pay my taxes, and I won't claim benefits that I'm not qualified for. I won't cheat the system, because these are high trust societies. What happens over time? I'll address that with some data in a moment. The second part I mentioned was the pay-go systems. These are basically pyramid schemes that's not particularly different from a chain letter or a Ponzi scheme. They require the base of the pyramid to continually get bigger for it to be sustainable. This is not happening anymore. So with the baby boom in the United States, not a problem. You had this huge number of children born, lots of people going in and paying. It looked absolutely sustainable until it's not anymore, because you cannot have an indefinite expansion of the base of the pyramid. This is why all pyramid schemes will collapse at one time or another. The incentive politically is to answer to those who are political voices. Those are called, and we use a technical language of sociology, old people. Right? It's old people who have political voices, and 8-year-olds do not. They don't vote, and they don't, well, they argue a lot, but they don't argue in politics. So we're basically sacrificing the children to the elderly who have political voices, and those children do not. The consequence is quite serious over the long term. It's a form of fiscal illusion. By the way, these are typically structured in such a way that it's even difficult for those who pay the burden to understand it. So take the American Social Security system. There's also, there are various schemes like this in Europe as well. They say, you're only paying 6%. And your employer pays the other 6%. So 6.25%. That's actually, and I hear another technical term in fiscal economics, bullshit. It's just not true. 100% is paid by the wage earner. 100%. But they only announce half of it. So every year I get a statement from the Social Security Administration, this is what you put in, and this is what your benefit is. But they count only half of what I put in. And the reason is, the so-called employer's share comes out of the employee's pocket. It's money that the employer is willing to pay to hire somebody, and the employer is indifferent whether it goes to that person or to somebody else. It's the cost of employment. Right? That money would go to the employee in the absence of this tax scheme. So the employee is paying 100%, but is only informed it's 50%. And so your employer is paying the other half. And then you pay the benefits now out of current revenues, and the future benefits will be paid out of future revenues. So don't worry about it now. Now everything is okay. I recall, and as I mentioned, that works until the base of the pyramid stops growing. When I was a kid growing up, we had Italian neighbors, and their parents, the adults who owned the house, and I was friends with their children, they had their parents come from Italy to visit. And I remember talking to them, and they said, we're so pleased, we're pensioners now. I said, oh, where does the money come from? Lo Stato. It comes from the state. And even then I said, where did they get their money from? Lo Stato. It's just from the state. Right? And this, of course, was quite popular with that generation. But now their grandchildren, or great-grandchildren, I should say, are in a very bad situation right now. As all kinds of other things have to be eliminated to make way for this. So Italy is a very interesting case study here. Tremendous economic growth after the war. They got rid of the fascist legislation, which many New Dealers and others admired Italy. Italy was a bit of a mess in a way. And tremendous, the miracolo economico after the war, huge increase in living standards, all kinds of new firms were founded, and the sweet life. This is the theme of these movies from the 50s and 60s about Italy. People could have a Vespa, they could go on vacations. This is something that unimaginable to previous generations of normal Italians. That was fantastic. And it generated such a feeling of prosperity that when there was a change of government from the liberal governments that had been dominant, or let's say broadly liberal conservative also after the war, in the 1960s, you get something very different. You see, we're so rich, we can afford a generous welfare state. We can pay for it. Look at how wealthy we are. It meant that those people old at the time, this was the elderly people came and visited when I was a child, they got tremendous benefits. They were very happy. The consequence, though, is a massive unfunded liability. So let's look at the US case. Unfunded liabilities is another element of this that is almost never addressed. So these are quite recent data. US GDP, $24 trillion. Okay? The federal debt is the one everyone focuses on, and it's roughly 100% debt to GDP ratio in the US, 100%, which is disturbingly high. But that debt is well, yes. It is still disturbingly high. It can be disturbingly higher in other countries. But it's just the tip of the iceberg. This is debt held by the public in the form of bonds and so on that people purchase. The unfunded liability needs to be added to that. Those are obligations of the state for which there's no corresponding revenue source. So this number is calculated over an infinite time horizon at 163 trillion, compared to the 24 trillion in net indebtedness of the state. If you calculate it over a mere 75-year time horizon on the thesis, not many of us are going to live more than 75 years, so fuck everyone would have come down, which is the basic of this approach. Even that is $78 trillion, which you calculate, it's about $600,000 per household in the United States. in present value terms of their obligations. $600,000 per household. So are these expenditures going to be made? The average household does not have $600,000 in assets, or the present value of its future earning potential is not $600,000 per household. For some, of course, it is, but not as an average across the whole society. What happens when these bills are due? And specifically, what will happen to our democratic systems? We will have someone who will say, I alone can solve it. Give me the absolute power to fix this problem. These ever-growing liabilities, these data, by the way, are not out of some conspiracy meeting or anything. They come directly out of the trustees' reports of the Social Security and Medicare systems. There are other additional ones we could add to it, but I just picked the big ones, which is Social Security and Medicare for the United States. It's not even just the unfunded liabilities that are at stake. Look at the current system's sustainability, and it is measured in decades, and specifically just a few of them. Something is going to change. And if we are not alert and paying attention to it, the thing that is sacrificed is likely to be our democracy. This is what I want to focus our attention on now. So, intergenerational transfers are the big deal. The one that gets most of the attention politically is intragenerational. So poor people and rich people and transfer payments within social groups. But the big one that is the most scary one is people my age ripping off people who are 20. And that is essentially our future right now, is a parasitic class of older people my age and above stealing from younger people. This is, I think, shameful but also quite scary. Now to this question of erosion of social trust, this contradiction question. The World Values Survey is a very useful source of evidence on this. It's also a little bit hard to work with because they don't always ask the same questions, the same populations over time. But Sanandaji and others have been looking at this and finding those questions that are asked consistently across various populations. And one of the questions was, do you agree that claiming government benefits to which you're not entitled is never justifiable? And they started asking this question in 1981 to 1984, so it's a multi-year panel study. Comparing those data with 2017 to 2022, which is the most recent updated data available, we saw a fall. The numbers here are a little bit misleading. In Sweden, it fell much more dramatically in the interim, and it's been going up in about the last 10 years. But it actually fell down closer to 55%. And I think because there's some better policies in Sweden, they've been adjusting this, more what we call workfare, with an understanding it's going to work. In addition to receiving the benefits, these numbers have been recovering. But the net fall is quite small, Canada, USA, and Sweden. And this is pretty bad over the long term. It means that restraints, internalized restraints on dipping into that common pool are eroding. And they're being eroded by the welfare state. Also, rates of willingness to engage in tax cheating. It's harder to measure tax cheating per se, because that's dependent partly on enforcement behavior and so on. But survey questions on, are you willing to cheat on your taxes, have moved in the same direction as well. So, as I mentioned, the obligations are not capable of being fulfilled. So just looking at the US, if you just take Social Security and Medicare, the two very big ones, $600,000 per household in terms of present value obligations, this is just not going to be paid. Something is going to happen. It means you're going to have large numbers of old people, and to be more politically focused, angry because they're not getting the benefits that they have been promised. And where is that going to take us? I wish I knew the answer, but it's time to talk about alternatives to the current system of welfare benefits. Some way to head this off, to limit claims on the system, to encourage more younger people to go into defined contribution plans rather than defined benefit plans where they're actually saving. In effect, returning to the pre-Bismarckian social saving systems in which you own the capital value of what has been set aside. Every day that we delay this, the problem gets a little bit worse. Every single day it becomes slightly worse. So this system, I mentioned, has been copied everywhere. I don't want to end up discussing all of the horrors of it, but it's fair to say that the evidence is it was what killed the Weimar Republic, and if we're not careful, it will kill ours as well. So with that, I'll stop with that cheery note, optimism, and I'd be happy to have a conversation about what to do about it in Belgium